Patty, are you able to hear me? Would you like to get started? You're on mute. So as Kadi comes off mute, thank you everyone for joining. Just a reminder that this meeting is available in multiple languages. If you'd like to listen to it, or any language that you'd like to listen to this meeting in, please first click on the globe with the label interpretation, and then choose the language that you would like to listen to this meeting in. Once you choose a language, you should not change it during the meeting. And if you do have a headset with a built-in microphone, that is preferable, but not required. And without further ado, Kadi, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. Welcome again to our second webinar about capability program. This is we're going to speak about how we can create an annual plan. Please, if you can see, please, next slide, please. Thank you. As you can see, the objectives of this capability building program matches closely with Sjogren's European objectives. Sjogren's Europe, we hope that with this program, will support our member associations and Sjogren's advocates by building capacity and adding to knowledge and skills in this space. Next slide, please. You can see this program consists of 4 parts based on recurring topics that Sjogren's patient organizations indicated they needed more support with during an online needs assessment and one-on-one discussions. That means that we have done a lot of homework and preparation work in order to finalize the 4 parts of our this capability program, and for that we thank very much Novartis. Our first session of this program focused on external communication strategies. Today's session is on operation and staffing strategy. In April, we will have a session on involvement in drug development, approval, and reimbursement processes. And after today's webinar, we will send a short survey to hear from you about topics you want to hear about. Next slide, please. As you can see, our today's webinar is, after me, I will give the floor to our expert speaker, who is Flora Rafai. Then we can have a small homework and workshop, interactive session, then wrap-up remarks, and then the webinar will have the results and going to be end. Next slide, please. Now I have the pleasure to introduce to our today's expert speaker, who is Mrs. Flora Rafai, an accredited transformational coach and small organization coach at Rapport Coaching. Flora is also a trustee and mentor for healthcare charities and works extensively with charities and non-profit organizations. She holds a Bachelor in International Relations from the London School of Economics and a Master in Social Innovation from the University of Cambridge Just Business School. Flora, yes, the floor is yours. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kati, and thank you so much, everyone, for allowing me to join you this evening. So as Kati mentioned, the focus of this webinar is really to help you think about how you can move from the day-to-day activities of the patient group to coming up with activity plans and hopefully even an annual plan. So I've been involved in very small charities, even where I was the only member of the team. So I appreciate how precious your time is. So this is very much going to be a practical webinar where you can start putting into practice some of the things we're going to talk about immediately. So hopefully it will be able to help you by the end of the hour and a half that we have together to really get going with your own activity plans and annual plans. So as Kati mentioned, the focus this afternoon or this evening we'll be firstly talking about how we can go from that day-to-day to an activity plan. And then we'll have some time for questions before we go into our first exercise. We'll then look at how we can move from activity plans to a full annual plan. And again, we'll take some time for questions to make sure you're happy and confident with what we've talked about. And then we'll do our final exercise before we wrap up. So as we get started, I would just like to invite you to have a reflection by yourself, write it down on a piece of paper that you have nearby to set your intention for this webinar. So answer these two questions of what is your intention and what do you hope to gain from this session? And the reason we're starting out with this is very much part of how you can move to having an activity plan, is always starting with why you're doing something and what you're hoping to do. So I'm just going to put myself on mute for a minute. Please do reflect and then we can get started. Okay, hopefully you've had a chance to answer those questions for yourself. And really just put that to one side now, and we'll reflect at the end to see how far we were able to get in achieving those for you. So as we get into this, so when you're running a small patient group, I'm sure you've felt like how I felt, which is you're being pulled into about 50,000 different directions. You're getting requests all the time, and you feel like there's never enough that you can do to make a dent in what people are asking for. And I know I've personally found that can be incredibly overwhelming, and it always feels like there's not quite enough hours in the day. So what I really recommend here is one of the most impactful things you can do as a small organization leader is to take that moment to step back from that and to start putting together a plan for yourself and for the organization of how you can start to tackle those things. And the benefits of this is that it firstly allows you to take control of the situation. So it can help you set that intention of where it is you actually want to go and what you want to do. And it can give you direction, and it can help you focus in on the priorities of what really matters. And the benefit of this is the second aspect, which is it allows you to, have permission to say no to things. So again, I know when you're running a charity, you're running a patient group, it can feel very personal to say no to someone. But when you're being pulled in those different directions, it's really important to be able to set boundaries so you can understand what it is feasible to do. And so you can have that permission to say yes to the things that really matter, and also have that objective plan with which you can say, actually, we can't achieve this right now, but we can look ahead and find a time where we can achieve it in the future. And this actually means that you end up having a much bigger impact on your community, because rather than being committed to things that you can't actually achieve, you can focus in on the things that you can, and that will have the most impact, and ultimately then mean that you can then go forward and do more things again in the future. And the third benefit of having this kind of activity plan is the ability to create a narrative for your organization. So when it's just you working away, this doesn't seem that important because you'll obviously know why you're doing things and you don't need to constantly explain it to yourself. But the moment you start to bring in new people, so whether that's volunteers or staff members, funders or partners, that you will need to repeatedly tell them the journey and the story of the organization. And having an organizational plan as something that you can share with them helps reduce the amount of times you have to repeat yourself firstly, but it also helps them see where they fit in and the impact of their personal contribution on the overall organization. And that can really motivate people to get involved. And it also helps with delegating activities to them, because ultimately they can see why they're doing what they're doing and how it fits in. And that really helps them then fulfill that activity to the best of their ability. So that's really why it's important to take that time to start planning and to start thinking about how you can be a bit more strategic with what you're doing. The way to really then start from going from just focusing on the day-to-day to moving to this broader plan is to start by thinking about two main factors. So firstly, the why. So I'll be saying this throughout. It's really important to set your intention. And as a patient group, this is quite a straightforward thing to do, because if there's a very clear reason why you exist, and it's to support your fellow patient community. And this can always be your North Star. This is always the direction in which you're going. So I've put up a few examples here that I've found on your websites. And this is a really fantastic way, apologies, to really start and make sure that everything that you're being asked to do does ultimately serve this vision. And the second thing to think about is how what you do actually has an impact and what your role is in having that impact. So again, when we have limited time and limited resources, it's really important to focus on the things that will get us closest to that vision and is something that we are feasibly able to do. So when we bring these two things together, our alignment to our vision and our impact on our community, that's how we come up with our most prioritized list of activities to do. And this will always mean that anything you prioritize and anything you say yes to is always serving the community that you're there to support. So this is actually going to be part of the activity that we do in a few minutes. So hopefully just keep this in your mind, and then we'll get a chance to do this. But what to do once you have your prioritized list is to then start to come up with a plan for your most prioritized activities. And the way to do that is ultimately to start by thinking about where we are now, to have that reflection of, if we take the example of organizing a family day for your patient community, now might be that we've done one every single year, so it's something that we understand. And our target where we'd like to get to is that by the end of 2023, we would like to have another family day. And ultimately, your activity plan, taking away all the business school jargon, is just working back from that target to now and figuring out how it is that we can get there. And the best way to do that I found is working through these 6 questions. So always starting with the why are we considering this activity? So again, revisiting how is it impacting our beneficiaries, our community, and how is it aligned to our vision? And from there, setting that target of what is it that we want to achieve with this activity. And a really important factor in this is, how do we know we've been successful in achieving it? And this is something that there's quite a lot of support with in the toolkit that I know you've seen and will be shared around after the webinar as well, around how you set those goals for yourself, because it's very easy to start working on something and keep plugging away at it. But then unless you've defined what good and end looks like, you never quite know if you should keep putting to it. So it's really important to set that goal out at the outset. And then when we move into how, this is where we start to think about what are those actions and stages that we need to take to fulfill that goal. And so what I recommend that you do here is firstly, just start with a brainstorm of all the different things that you might need to do to achieve that goal. So if we stay with the example of a family day, it might be that some of those actions involved would be finding a venue, getting catering, sending out invitations, doing a feedback form. So when you're first doing this, don't try and be logical about what order they need to be in. Just start getting it out of your brain of what are all the different things that will ultimately need to be done. And once you have that brainstorm list, that's when you can start to see what things fit together. So if you're looking at a venue, that's a good time to look at catering as well. If you're sending out invites, that's also a good time to be thinking about what kind of travel expenses you might need to be reimbursing to people. So you can start to map it out and then logically put it in one order they need to happen. And as you're doing that, that's when the when can really come in. So partly that order of timings of this needs to happen in this month, and then this needs to happen in this month. But also thinking about how much time each of these activities are actually going to take and map that out, because that's again an aspect of thinking about how feasible it is for you to do all of these within the timeline you're thinking. And when you're trying to figure out the time involved in activities, my rule of thumb is always to think about things taking either 1 hour, 2 hours, half a day, a full day, or several full days, however many they might be. And the reason for that is because that builds in a lot of time for delays to come up. So if we take the example of writing the invite to your family day, that might feel like it's a 5-10 minute job tops. But then as you start to write it, you might realize you need to have the agenda open. You might need to find Google Maps, a link to how to find the venue. Suddenly you get a phone call, that takes some time. If you have children, they might come in, they might need support with something. And suddenly that full hour gets filled out. So having that 1 hour, 2 hour, half day, full day, multiple of days approach just means that you're building in enough flexibility for delays to happen in a way that doesn't then disrupt your whole plan and require the whole thing to be rethought. So it's really valuable when you're thinking about when to really try and figure out that timing. And I'll touch back on this later when we're talking about building out your team around activities, because it really helps set expectations of how long things take. When we move on to where, this is both a physical location of where the activity itself will take place. So is it in person? Is it online? What platform is it if it's online? If it's in person, what part of the country? What travel arrangements might need to be? But it's also where in terms of where do the participants in the activity need to be. So if you have volunteers helping you, do they also physically need to be there? Can they be at home? So you can start to map out the locations of everyone involved in the activity as well as the activity itself. And the final question, who? So this is a very key question because we can come up with very ambitious plans, but then ultimately we need to make sure we have people who can actually deliver the activity. So this is partly just thinking about who the person can be who runs it. It might just be you, it could be a partner, it could be a funder. And then what's really valuable is to start thinking about what skills they need to be able to do the activity. And I'll touch on this more a little bit later on, but skills might be, if they need to do emails, then having digital skills so they are able to use a computer, which we take for granted, but not everyone has. It might be they need good communication skills if they're talking to people on the phone. So really just try and map that out as you're going through. And in the second half of the webinar, we'll touch on how you can then use that to build out a good team for yourself. So really working through those 6 questions, you can end up with a really solid plan for each activity. And then in the second half of the webinar, we'll move on to how you can take each of those activity plans and build an annual plan around it. So I will pause there now just for some questions, and then we'll do our first exercise, at which time you'll have a chance to start putting this into action. So if we pause on questions, I'm happy for, I think there's a Q&A function, or you can put it in the chat and we can talk through. So does anyone have anything they'd like to ask?
You can also use the raise your hand feature and I'll unmute you as well.
Great,
Lots of options to provide your questions.
May I ask something,
Yeah,
Flora? You are
Mm-hmm.
talking about an activity plan of one activity.
Mm-hmm.
So you're proposing that in order to have the final activity, the annual activity plan of an association, we have first think one by one the plans, the activities we want to do, and if we are capable to do them. Is that correct?
Yes,
What
so
I mean.
I'm suggesting that to build out, it can be very intimidating to go from having no plan to a full annual plan. So my suggestion is to start building that habit by planning out individual activities. And then from there, you can work up to an annual plan, which is what we'll talk about in the second half as well.
Okay, because our needs, our members' needs is how to build an annual plan, because we cannot send to our individuals or to our sponsor one by one, whatever we think, or we're planning one activity to send them an email and said, okay, let's think now, we're planning that. Do you know? They want us to have an annual activity plan. So you're suggesting that in order to have our members to have an annual activity plan, they have to stay, discuss it, and discuss 1, 2, or 3 activities, and then make with them an activity plan. This is what you're proposing?
Yes, and we'll talk about how you can go from that to building out that full plan. So I've got a template later on of how you can pull all of that together into one plan, which then can be shared with funders and with partners.
Okay, thank you.
I haven't seen anything in the chat. Maggie, does anyone have their hand up?
No hands up. And just a reminder to everyone, feel free to use your own language, whatever you're most comfortable with, either in the chat or when you raise your hand. But no questions right now, Flora.
Okay, what I might do then is if we move on to the exercise, it might be that at that stage, more questions come up as you have to put it into practice. So let me just bring it up. So prior to the webinar, I believe you were sent a pre-work handout. Perfect, and Rashmik has also put it in the chat, to start thinking about what some of the activities might be that you want to do for this year. If you haven't had a chance to do that, don't worry about it. We have time to do that now. So in the handout sheet that's just been linked in the chat, what I'd invite you to do is to reflect on what are those activities that you were hoping to do this year in 2023, or that you've been invited to do by your community or partners. And then start that prioritization process by first thinking about how aligned are those activities to your vision, and what is the potential impact on your community. So I want you to rate each one out of 5, with 1 being the lowest score and 5 being the best. And then once you've done that, to add up those scores, so you get an overall score out of 10. And from there, you can start to prioritize what your best activities are. So something that's getting a score of a 9 or a 10 out of 10 would be absolute top priority. And something that's more a 1 or a 2, that's quite low priority, and is something that, should you have the capability to do alongside everything else, brilliant, but it's probably something that you can put lower down in your order of what you do things in. So that should take you probably about 5 minutes or so. And then in the second 5 minutes, I want you to start looking at what your most prioritized activity is and start that activity plan. So describe what the current state of the activity is, where you'd like to be by the end of 2023, and start working through those 6 questions of why, what, how, when, where, and who. So we've got 10 minutes, so we're just coming up to, by my time, 5 o'clock, and I think by European time, 6 o'clock. So if we now work until 10 past the hour, we can then come back and reflect on any questions. So I will put myself, apologies, I'll leave that up. I'll put myself on mute, but if anyone does have any questions, I'll be here throughout to answer. So yeah.
Maggie or Rashmika, they told me that they cannot write in the QA box because they have to give you have to give them access. Could you please make it accessible for everybody?
Yes, I can put the sharing.
We'll look at that.
Because I did also myself, and I said that I have to ask for an access, for a permission. Please make it accessible for everybody.
So because it's shared for everyone, everyone will need to make a copy of it to be able to edit it, but it should now be editable if you reload your screen.
No.
So I've just noticed that people are using the same. I just encourage you to make a copy of the document because at the moment everyone can see what you're putting into the template.
Okay.
Okay, so I'll start to bring you back to the webinar. Hopefully that has been a good start to thinking through your priorities and the activity plan for your priorities. I've not seen any other questions come through, so please do put them in the chat as you go, or put your hand up if you have any questions. But otherwise, we'll move on to the second half, which is where we can start to use those to build out our annual plan. So as you work through those activity plans and start to build out those overall sense of time and staffing involved, we can then start to think about the resources required to have these plans take place. So if we move on to staffing, and here I use the word staffing to include both volunteers or staff if you're able to, if you have funding to pay for staff. And what I recommend here is, rather than thinking about just who's available, starting to think about what skills you need to fulfill all the different activities that you want to do as an organization. And so what I recommend is you start by looking at what are the skills across the different activities that you're looking to run, and then start to group those into common themes, and from there come up with that job role. So I've got an example that I've come up with that I know in my patient group that I've been involved with, we see a lot, which is we'll need people who are able to use Facebook and Twitter, who are able to update websites, create graphics, use things like Instagram, and write newsletters. And when you've seen that across the activities, you can then start to group those together into common themes. So here an example would be the ability to use social media, to have image editing, video editing, have strong written communication and strong IT and digital skills. And from that, you can come up with a job role. So I've made an example job role here. And this is where having a plan helps really with creating a narrative and enabling delegation. So all the different aspects of the activity plan come together into this job role. So looking at work-based, that's when you're thinking about where. So in this case of this volunteer, home working would be fine. When you're thinking about when and the timing involved in all the different activities, you can come up with a sense of what commitment you're requiring from that volunteer. In this middle section, you can then come up with what are the tasks that that person might be involved with. And then finally, what are the skills that they need to demonstrate in the person's specification. And this can make it so much easier to help set the boundaries and set expectations with your volunteer or staff member about what they're expected to do, which means that they can feel a lot more confident in doing those things and getting on with it, rather than coming back to you constantly to ask for more things to do and not being sure how they fit in. And it also means that you can be a bit more strategic in how you recruit volunteers or staff members, because you can put this out there and people who like the sound of the role and also have the right skills can then approach you and take it on. So it's just a really valuable tool of making sure you have the right people in place to help you with achieving your goals. The second thing to think about is about your budget. So ultimately, the two key resources you need as a patient group are team members to be able to do the activities, and then the money to be able to do it as well. So what you can start to see as you're putting together your different activities is you can start to see where are costs that might start coming up. And this is what you would put on the left-hand side. So itemize out the different costs that might be across the group. And so I've pulled out some of the things that all of us will need to pay for at some point. We'll need to pay volunteer expenses. We'll need to pay something around website or helpline. And we probably all have things that we print off. And then on the right-hand side, we have our annual cost. Apologies, the headings for some reason are not showing up on the slide, but they should be headed item and cost. And so the value of this is that often when you're doing individual activities, you don't necessarily recognize the background big costs that build up, like having to host your website. And so pulling it together across the year means that you can have a much clearer idea of what those costs are going to be, and making sure that you put that into funding bids to funding partners. The other thing I wanted to highlight is the difference in how you can get to a budget. So some of the things you may have noted are written calculated, and the other is noted as estimated. So calculated costs are where there's a real number that you can find that tells you how much that particular item is going to cost. So with printed materials, if you know you need to print off 1,000 leaflets, you can go to a printing service and ask them how much that's going to cost. And so you can come up with a clear, concrete number. Whereas with estimated costs, that's usually where you have a new activity you've not done before, or it's something that's uncertain. So there's not really a no number out there that you can come up with. The importance is that you do still include this because it will be a cost, but you just might not know precisely what it will be. And so what I recommend here is you bring as much information as you can to ultimately estimate what it might cost. So with volunteer expenses, you might know that you need your 10 volunteers to help you with a specific event every single month. And that you can then look at, okay, where's the location of that event and what might be the average journey someone might need to take to get there. And from there, come up with how much it might cost. So I'll also point out all of these numbers are just here as an example. Please don't put this in your budget. But that's how you can come up with an estimation for your volunteer expense. And I do recommend that whenever you're doing an estimation, you are very conservative about how much it might end up costing. So you always put in, okay, well, if all 10 volunteers claim for the full expenses, then it will look like this much. It's possible it will end up costing less, but having that approach means that you're never ending up with it costing much more than how much you've put down as an estimate or a calculated cost. And you can then have a conversation with your funder of, if you've overestimated, they might ask for you to give that money back, but it always means that you have enough to cover the costs that you do have. So that's really about budgeting. And then the final thing that you can start to bring together with having an annual plan is finding where you can streamline all the work that you're doing. So again, when you're only focusing on each individual activity plan, you might feel like you're doing it as efficiently and effectively as possible. But when you start to bring it all together and see the full picture, you might find different areas in which you can save yourself a lot of time. So the three main ways I recommend that you might find the ability to streamline is firstly through the use of templates. So I use templates a lot, especially email templates. So often you'll realize that you get very similar inquiries from the patient community. They're asking very similar questions, or you're having to write very similar emails, for example, when you're sending out joining instructions for an event. And so coming up with a template is where you have one example that you're very happy with and you just save that for next time. So rather than having to write everything from scratch, you can then reuse that template and just amend it so it fits the situation which you're using it the best. And so I do this a lot for emails, but you can also expand this to newsletters. If you use social media a lot, then you can have templates for the type of images you use and then just replace the text and image on it, but the formatting stays the same. So across a year, this can save a huge amount of time. The other way I like to streamline is through the use of processes. So this, a good example for this is if you're having to organize an event, while each event will look very different, so a family day will feel very different from a medical conference, the steps you have to take will be very similar. You'll need to find venues, you'll need to find speakers, you'll need to find, you'll need to send out invitations, you'll need to do feedback forms, all of those things. And having to remember that every single time takes up a lot of mental space and a lot of energy. And so I really recommend, again, next time you're doing one of these activities that you repeat, to just write out a checklist for yourself or a slightly longer manual of how you go about doing it. So the benefit of this to you personally is that it means that you can deliver it to the same level, same high quality every time, but without taking all of that time to remember what you did it last time. The other side of it is that it means it's so much easier to delegate this to someone else. because again, you've laid out exactly what needs to be done to the standard you want it to be done to, and you can give that to someone else and feel confident that they will follow that checklist and do it to the same level that you would have done it yourself. So it takes a slightly longer time when you write it, but it saves so many hours across a year if you've done that for yourself and for your team. And the final thing that I'm really love, and we could probably spend a whole webinar exploring, is around how you can use online tools to streamline your work. So the first example I've put up is message scheduling. And this is where, again, staying with the event example, you know you have to send out the invitations at a certain time. Well, a lot of email systems like Gmail and Outlook have this built in now that you can write that email and then you can schedule it to automatically send at the time you want it to go out. And the benefit of this is that it can just average out your workload a lot more, rather than requiring you to be on that day available at that exact time to write that email. You can do it even months in advance when you've got a little bit more time, and then send it out and know that it will go out when it needs to. Similarly with your calendar, I don't know if this happens to you as well, but I often, whenever I have to go to a meeting, there's about 5 emails that goes into, are you available at this time? No, I'm not. What about this time? No, I'm not. Before you finally get up to the time that you're both available. And again, Outlook and Gmail and other email platforms now have it built in that you can just set your availability, and that's as a link, and people can go in and just select a time that's also convenient for them. And it automatically sends out joining instructions if you're using something like Zoom. And it can save you so much time, which you can then use to obviously have more impact for your community. And the final aspect, which is starting to be very exciting, is around AI, so artificial intelligence drafting. And so I say this with the caveat that these are not intelligent tools at this stage, but they are fantastic ways to, again, overcome the limitation of having a blank sheet in front of you. So I, for example, use it a lot for social media. So if there's a tweet or a Facebook post that needs to go out, and I'm not quite sure how to quite say what I want to say, I have my bullet points, but I'm not quite sure how to put it together. There are tools, I don't know if anyone's heard of the tool called Canva, but I can share that as a link in the chat in a minute, where it can just take your bullet points and come up with a nicely worded tweet or Facebook post within the number of characters you want it to use, which you can then edit and improve and then make sure it's appropriate to go out. So it's a great tool for getting that first draft going, which is often the hardest, and you can then edit it and make it appropriate to the situation you want to use. So again, as you come together with your annual plan, that's the time when you can really start to see how you can save yourself time by having that overarching view. So how do you bring all of that together into an annual plan? So the process of this is firstly starting with where we are now. So same as with your activity plan, thinking about what is our current state, and then setting that target of where we'd like to be by the end of the year. So this is something that you can have one overarching target, or you can have several smaller targets, but it's defining for yourself what success looks like by the end of the year. And there's quite a bit in that toolkit that will be shared with you after the event around how you can come up with what are known as SMART goals to make sure you really can measure that success. And once you have that target, that's when you can bring in your prioritized activities. So you can brainstorm what are all the things you want to do, and then prioritize them based on that alignment to your vision and mission. And from there, that's where you start to bring together each of those prioritized activity plans and flesh out what that team plan looks like, what that budget plan looks like, and how that comes together and how you can streamline it so you can put in the most and have the most impact at the end. So what this can look like is, this is a template of an annual plan, which again will be shared with you after the webinar. And this brings together all of these different aspects. So it has your vision and mission right at the top. And that is really important to just keep reminding you of that is why you're doing what you're doing, and everything should ultimately always be going towards those aims. You can then, as you look through the table from the left, start listing out what those activities are that you want to do. And key actions, put in those key stages that you need to do for each activity. And then deadline is where you bring in the when of when you want to do everything by. You then assign it to a responsible volunteer. And finally, you have your target for every single activity of what you want it to look like by the end of the year. And this is a fantastic way of, again, coming back to the benefits of having a plan. This is a very clear way of taking control within the chaos of all the different requests. It helps you have that permission to say yes to things that fit with the plan, but also permission to say no to things that fall outside of it and are not priorities enough to be able to do. And it most importantly helps with that creating a narrative of making sure that you can very clearly communicate to everyone how you're going to achieve what you want to achieve and what that organizational journey will be for the year. Now, I do just want to take a moment to talk about how you actually then deliver the plan, because it's wonderful to have a plan and it can really give you a sense of control and as direction of what you're going in. You still actually have to do it. So once you have the plan, that's when you get into a cycle of planning, delivering, and monitoring. So as a patient group leader, it's very important that you stay on top of what is actually being done. And so what I do sort of on a monthly basis is bring up my plan, look at what we've done and how that's going towards what we said we were going to do, and have this sort of cycle between planning, delivering, and monitoring, seeing if we're starting to drift, and then slightly replanning how we can get back on track. So that's a very active process. It's not a plan that you just put on the shelf and forget about as the year goes on. And then the final stage that's very important is to make sure you evaluate how you've done. So as you're nearing the end of the year, I always recommend about 2 or 3 months out from the end of the year, taking a moment to pause and reflect on how we've managed to go, what we've managed to achieve, and we'll be honest, what we haven't been able to achieve, because there'll always be things, endless things that we could do, but we haven't necessarily gotten to. And then we start that process again. So that's why, again, I recommend you start to do this about 2 or 3 months out, because as you evaluate what you've done, you can then start that process again of reflecting where you are, then setting a target for the next year, prioritizing and coming up with your plan for the subsequent year. And the value of doing that 2 to 3 months out is that not only does that mean you can start the new year hitting the ground running and having everything in place to be able to fulfill your plan, but it also means that you have enough time to do things like fundraising for the plan. Because again, we can come up with a wonderful plan, but we need to make sure we have the funding there, or even the recruiting of staff there to be able to deliver it. And giving yourself that 2 to 3 months to do it often means that there's enough time, if you're recruiting staff or volunteers, for them to apply and for you to appoint them. And if you're fundraising, then that's usually the amount of time that it takes for funders to consider applications and either award the funding or not. So that's really the overall cycle to think about. And I will now again pause for some questions if anyone has anything before we do our final exercise of the webinar. So again, please feel free to put up your hand or put it in the chat box if you have any questions. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions at the moment.
Yes,
Yep.
oui, moi.
Yes, go ahead.
C'est plus une remarque qu'une question. Merci beaucoup, Flora, pour ces présentations vraiment très claires et très impressionnantes. Merci pour le tableau, un des derniers tableaux présentés. Je trouve qu'il résume bien la façon de s'organiser et l'importance pour nous, associations, de se structurer. J'ai juste une petite remarque, en fait, je me pose la question de savoir comment on est tous des patients, donc on est tous des malades, d'accord? Donc c'est vrai que c'est génial de s'organiser comme ça, de prévoir, et cetera. À quel moment on intègre le fait que, eh ben, on peut ne pas être disponible, le bénévole dont vous parlez ou la personne en charge de la mission peut ne pas être disponible. Donc dans ce cas-là, qu'est-ce que vous nous conseillez? Est-ce que vous nous conseillez, je ne sais pas, par exemple, si c'est possible de doubler les postes? Est-ce que vous nous conseillez de faire des plus grandes marges de manœuvre dans le temps, dans le planning? Comment est-ce qu'on peut au final, pour pas être, comme vous disiez à l'instant, pour pas être découragé si on n'a pas atteint nos objectifs ou voilà, comment est-ce qu'on intègre cette notion de malade, en fait? Parce qu'il faut pas oublier que parfois, on veut faire beaucoup de choses et bon, vous donniez l'exemple des enfants. Oui, parce qu'on est parfois à la maison et on peut être interrompu. Mais on a aussi un gros facteur, nous, qui est quand même la maladie et qui peut nous empêcher, qui peut mettre à mal un peu tous ces plans. Comment est-ce que vous nous conseillez, nous, associations et voilà, pas entreprise, mais plus association, du coup, de gérer ce facteur complètement aléatoire et imprévisible?
That's an excellent question. And I think the first and most important thing is to be kind to yourself about recognizing that you are living with a condition and that there'll be times when you don't feel well, and there'll be times when people who are supporting don't feel well and won't be able to do it. So that's a reality that we need to be kind to and to accept that is what's happening. I think, as you say, one aspect of it is to think about building that into the plan, that there will be times that people aren't available. And so that's where we can think about how across the team that we can build up who is able to step in and support, especially if it's you as a leader. That's where having the clear communication of expectations can help. So even if you are not available, people know what they might need to do until you're able to come back and support once again. And I think it's also part of that feasibility project of we all want to do everything for our community, but it's recognizing how much capability we might have to do those activities and focusing possibly on doing less, but then doing things that we know we can actually achieve. So I think it's a combination of recognizing the realities and then planning for if something does go wrong. And with any kind of risk like that, so 4 main things that I recommend people think about is how we can maybe mitigate the risk, so having someone else who can step up, how we can avoid the risk, so that might be about making sure that we have clear support in place should someone be unwell, and how we might be able to accept the risk and know that it might be something that goes wrong, but we'll find other ways around it. And even there's an aspect of transferring the risk. So trying to find partners who might be able to support, who are able to step in as well. So Katy, I see your hands up if you want to come in there as well.
Merci Flora, merci.
Katy, I didn't know if you wanted to add, because I can see you've got the hand up reaction.
Ναι, yes. May I speak in my language. Εάν είδα ότι έχετε βάλει έναν προϋπολογισμό, στον προϋπολογισμό έχετε βάλει και ένα ποσό για την αμοιβή των εθελοντών. Αυτό σημαίνει, το βάλαμε θεωρητικά για να ξέρουμε πόσο θα μας κόστιζε ή το βάλαμε για να τους δώσουμε κάτι, να υπολογίζουμε ότι κάτι πρέπει να πάρουν και οι εθελοντές?
So there I've used it as a theoretical how much we might want to give. So each country will have its own legal rules around how much you're able to pay volunteers. So in the UK, which is where I am, that's if they have travel expenses, if they need to buy lunch while they're doing fulfilling their duties, that kind of thing. That's where I've estimated that from. So really it's creating a pot from which we could pay out that amount of money rather than knowing for sure that that's what they're going to claim, if that makes sense.
But you said volunteers, 50 euros per volunteer. This is not the travel expenses, because you have travel expenses. If you go back to the slide, you will see that you have volunteers, 50 euros per volunteer, I think. And then you had travel expenses, etc. So this, yes. What is 50 euros per month? It's for their travel expenses.
It could be travel expenses, it could be lunch, it could be whatever they might need to pay out.
It's not actually it's not their remuneration or their fees or something like that, but it's all the expenses of them.
Yes,
to reimburse the expenses. Okay,
yeah.
thank
So
you.
it's an estimation. I mean, this obviously your organizational budget will have many more things involved.
Okay,
but for this example,
thank you very much. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Perfect. I'm not seeing any more questions come in the chat, so I'll just take us through to our exercise. And again, as before, if any questions do come up, right, then please do ask them as you go. But so this final exercise is to get you a bit closer to that annual plan. So to think about what are, on page 3 of the handout, what are some of those skills that you think you'll need for the overall activity that you are starting to plan out, and then see if you're starting to see any kind of volunteer roles come out. And similarly, think about what are those budget items that might be coming up in your activity. So are there venue costs, are there expenses, catering costs, helpline costs, all of those things. Just start to pick out what might have a cost. And then I'm not expecting you to come up with the number during 10 minutes, but just start to think about, is this something that you think you can research and find an actual cost for, or is it something you're going to need to estimate? And finally, in the final sort of 2 or 3 minutes, as you look back at the activity, just start to think, is there something that you could streamline in there, possibly by creating a template or a process, or using one of the online tools I mentioned. So by my clock, it's currently 37. So if we come back at 47 past the hour, I'll do a quick wrap up and then hand back to Katy for the end of the webinar. So again, please feel free to put any questions as they come up, but otherwise we'll come back in 10 minutes after the exercise. Okay, I'm going to invite you all back to the webinar now. Hopefully that has given you a chance to start thinking about getting to that annual plan around your resources. So as we draw to a close, just to recap on what we've talked about. So we've talked about how moving from just focusing on the day-to-day can help you start to take control and create a narrative for the organization, and that you can start to build out an activity plan by just going through the 6 questions of why, what, sorry, I always forget when I have to say it out loud. So why, what, how, who, where, and when. And that can start to bring together the different activities that you need to do. And from there, you can bring it together into a full annual plan by thinking about your target for the year, how those activities fit together, what support you might need from staff, from budget, and then how you might be able to streamline it so you can make the most of the time that you have. So as we draw to a close, I would just like you to now do that evaluation piece that I was suggesting that you do at the end of a year as well, is to think about what are your key learning points from this presentation, what will you do differently tomorrow, and going back to your intention, to what extent did you achieve your intention for this webinar? So again, I will just give you a minute to note this down for yourself before I hand you back to Katy. Perfect. Well, thank you so much for listening to me. I hope you have found it useful and it's helped you get on that journey to coming up with an annual plan. I've just put up my contact details, so if you do have any questions that have come up after you reflect on this further, please do get in touch with me. And again, it's been wonderful to speak to you this evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Flora, for your wonderful presentation. It was very exciting because we learned a lot, and I think that our members learned and saw how they can have very easily an activity plan, a yearly activity plan. If they start to plan one activity, a single activity, then they can do a second, third, and then they can have one activity plan. And they learn how they can prioritize their needs, and they can say even no in some of our in their colleagues in their environment. And this was very interesting also for everybody. We would like to thank you again. We would like to inform everybody that the webinar is recorded, and there would be subtitled all that the webinars in all languages were provided in as interpretation. There will be uploaded in our YouTube channel and in our website, so it will be available on demand of every member, of every single one who wants to listen again, to watch it again, or for those who cannot be managed to join this webinar today, it will be available. And thank you very much for that. And we also want to thank you again once more, Novartis, because without their support, and VOZ, of course, VOZ is the PR agency of Novartis, who are supporting us in order to organize all that webinars. And Novartis is our supporter. We're working and we're organizing this webinars, this program with their cooperation. So once, many thanks to all the teams. Please, if you have, yes, Please just click on the link where I think it's in the chat, or scan this QR code, because we would like to provide us with your feedback. This is for our members. Please take 1-2 minutes to complete this form in order to hear from you what is your thought, what do you believe, to evaluate what we are doing. It's very important for us. Thank you once again. Yes, can you next slide, please? Okay, so this is our end, and we're going to have more information about the webinar 3 in beginning of April. Stay tuned, and thank you very much for joining us in our this webinar. Thank you again, and have a nice evening. Ramska, the floor to you. Maggie?
Thank you, everyone. I hope everyone has a wonderful evening. We'll just leave it open in case people are still clicking on the link, provide their feedback on the SurveyMonkey. But otherwise, we'll see you in April. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.